The Case of Aron. Sandor Ferenczi's Radical Experiment in Psychoanalysis. By Christopher Fortune. Part 2. Mutual Analysis. Sometime in 1929-30, Severn demanded that Ferenczi allow her to analyze him 12. Even with Ferenczi's superhuman therapeutic efforts, her analysis had been stalled for the last 2 years. She told Ferenczi that she suspected he harbored hidden negative feelings, hate and anger toward her, which blocked the analysis. Until she analyzed those feelings in him, she said, the analysis would remain at an impasse. Ferenczi resisted for a year and then reluctantly agreed to submit to Severn's analysis of him. Ferenczi, 1932, page 99. On the couch in January 1932, the month he began his clinical diary, Ferenczi admitted, I did hate the patient, Severn, in spite of the friendliness I displayed. p. 99. Braced for the worst, he was surprised by Severn's reaction. He wrote, the first torrent of the patient's effects, desire to die, notions of suicide, flight, is succeeded, quite remarkably, by relative composure and progress in the work. Attention becomes freer of exaggerated fantasies. p. 11. Curiously, this had a tranquilizing effect on the patient, who felt vindicated. Page 99. Ferenczi felt afraid, humiliated, and exposed by his self-disclosures, yet he was intrigued by their positive outcomes. Once I had openly admitted the limitations of my capacity, she even began to reduce her demands on me. I really find her less disagreeable now, my interest in the details of the analytical material and my ability to deal with them which previously seemed paralyzed. Improved significantly. Page 99. As well, Ferenczi discovered that through her analysis of him, Severn had strengthened her belief in the reality of her own early traumas. On January 31, 1932, he noted, the first real advances toward the patient's gaining conviction of the external reality of the traumatic events occurred in conjunction with some genuinely emotionally colored fragments of the analysis of the analyst. p. 26. In summary, through mutual analysis, Ferenczi found that honesty, even admitting his dislike for Severn, increased her trust, making him a better analyst and deepening the therapy. Ferenczi deduced that the real relationship between analyst and analysand can be therapeutic and can strengthen the therapeutic alliance. Who should get credit for this success? He asks, pages 99 to 100. His answer? Himself, for risking the experiment, but foremost, of course, the patient, who never ceased fighting for her rights. p. 101. Although the experiment brought analytical progress and yielded valuable clinical insights, Ferenczi decided there was some risk in putting himself into the hands of a not undangerous patient. p. 100. Needless to say, there were other practical difficulties. Ferenczi concluded that mutual analysis could only be a last resort. Proper analysis by a stranger, without any obligation, would be better, he cautioned. Page 22. It is unclear from the diary how mutual analysis ended. As early as March 1932, Severn criticized Ferenczi for his half-hearted participation in his analysis by her, Ferenczi, 1932, page 46. Afterwards, Ferenczi tried to return to a traditional analytic relationship. It proved to be impossible. On October 2, 1932, in his last diary entry, a discouraged and exhausted Ferenczi wrote, an attempt to continue analyzing unilaterally. Emotionality disappeared, analysis insipid, relationship distant. Once mutuality has been attempted, one-sided analysis then is no longer possible, not productive. p. 213. Finally, prefiguring the future interest in relational aspects in psychoanalysis, Ferenczi asks, now the question, must every case be mutual, and to what extent? Page 213. Ferenczi's query about mutuality begs another. What was Elizabeth Severn's experience of mutual analysis? And, as his analyst, what was Severn's view of Ferenczi? In another study, Fortune, in preparation, I elaborate on these questions in detail. Suffice it to say that Elizabeth Severn not only convinced Ferenczi of her trauma, but, as his analyst, helped uncover and persuade him of the significance of his own childhood traumas. In his diary, he wrote of a weak, emotional outburst, grief, shock, regret, breaking down with tears in the eyes, as a result of highly painful super-performances of youth and childhood, only grasped through reconstruction as compensation for very significant traumata. Ferenczi, 1932, page 26. Ferenczi felt that Severn had helped him, through the analysis, to access deeper layers of his psyche. For example, on July 19, 1932, he wrote, psychoanalytical insight into my own emotional emptiness, which was shrouded by overcompensation, repressed unconscious, psychosis, led to a self-diagnosis of schizophrenia, p. 160. Both Severn and Ferenczi believed that through mutual analysis they had discovered the consequences of their childhood traumas. Ferenczi, 1932, pages 14, 26. Severn, 1933a, page 140. In his diary, Ferenczi wrote, "The combined result of the two analyses is summarized by the patient. Severn, your, Ferenczi, greatest trauma was the destruction of genitality. Mine was worse. I saw my life destroyed by an insane criminal, my mind destroyed by poisons and suggested stultification, my body defiled by the ugliest mutilation at a most inappropriate time. Ostracism from a society in which no one wants to believe me innocent. Finally, the horrendous incident of the last experience of being murdered, p. 14. In their dialogue of unconsciousness, page 84, as Ferenczi called it, the boundaries between Severn and himself were blurred and, at times, even erased. It is as though two halves had combined to form a whole soul, he reflected, page 14. In this analytical confusion of tongues, mutuality infused even the uncovered traumas. Ferenczi believed this could lead to a therapeutic outcome. He wrote, what Severn has uncovered about the analyst, Ferenczi, she must acknowledge as a distant reflection of her own sufferings. And if this succeeds, then her former disintegration and consequently the tendency to project insanity will in fact be mutually reversed, p. 159. The experiment in mutual analysis was paradoxically a brilliantly daring idea, yet possibly a clinical mistake. It remains enigmatic and can be seen from a number of perspectives. For example, Freud wrote that Ferenczi felt saved by Severn's analysis, Letter to Jones, in Masson, 1984, pages 180 to 181. For Ferenczi, she succeeded where Freud, as his former analyst, had failed. Yet, to what extent did Ferenczi fall under Severn's spell? Was he so overwhelmed by her power and pathology that he lost his clinical detachment? By failing to interpret instead of giving in to Severn's demand to analyze him, did Ferenczi undermine her analysis? To what degree did she influence his belief that his own deep-rooted traumas were the source of his psychological suffering? In the end, for Ferenczi and Severn, mutual analysis may have remained both a success and a failure. The ending. Elizabeth Severn's letters to her daughter suggest that she and Ferenczi had difficulties at the end. By the fall of 1932, Ferenczi was sick with pernicious anemia. He attributed it to exhaustion and to his disappointment in Freud, Dupont et al., 1982, page 127. Severn herself was desperate. She had no money and was distraught, suffering from extremes of emotion as she reacted to Ferenczi's necessary withdrawal to conserve his dwindling strength. She was also distressed because she believed that Ferenczi was avoiding the subject of the termination of her analysis and her imminent departure from Budapest. Adding to her confusion, Severn reported that Ferenczi insisted that she keep his analysis by her a secret. At the same time, she wrote that he wished her to proclaim herself cured by his analysis, M. Severn T. Severn, December 23, 1932, M. Severn Collection. In late February 1933, Elizabeth Severn said her last goodbye to Ferenczi and boarded the train for Paris to stay with her daughter, Margaret, who was a dancer in a ballet company at the time. She would never see Ferenczi again. On her arrival in Paris, she was in such critical mental and physical collapse that Margaret wrote Ferenczi a terrible letter of protest, M. Severn, Personal Communication, May 8, 1986. But Ferenczi was already bedridden and too weak to reply. On May 22, 1933, he died in Budapest. After Ferenczi. It is not known what impact Ferenczi's death had on Elizabeth Severn. In any event, by mid-June, she was strong enough to make her way to London, where she recovered emotionally and resumed her own psychotherapy practice. Severn's 1933a third book, The Discovery of the Self, begun in Budapest in 1932, was published in the fall of 1933. Stylistically dated, the text is lucid for an author so recently in the throes of psychological torment. In the book, Severn attempts to integrate her earlier psychotherapy, methods, and body-mind philosophy with her later analytic influences and sets them within her overarching metaphysical spiritual beliefs. Given her subjectivity as a patient, she writes about psychoanalysis even-handedly, with critical detachment. Severn values psychoanalysis, but challenges its emphasis on the regressive over the progressive tendencies of the individual and reminiscent of her earlier approaches champions healing and cure beyond analysis. Although she mentions Ferenczi in only a few places, certain chapters can be seen as a companion to Ferenczi's last writings, particularly the clinical diary and confusion of tongues paper. In an obvious outcome of their work together, Severn demonstrates her solidarity with Ferenczi. In interpreting her cases, she calls for the recognition of the significance of childhood sexual trauma, the dynamics of fragmentation as a reaction to early traumatic shock, and the necessity to relive and repeat the trauma in therapy as a corrective emotional experience. Not surprisingly, her comments on dissociation and multiple personality nave the ring of direct experience. In the extreme, Severn appears to eliminate any influence of fantasy in mental disturbance, claiming that unsettling psychic events, such as nightmares, simply reflect forgotten facts - real past traumas. Severn, 1933a, page 120. Although she seems determined to convince the reader of the exclusive role of external reality in psychic trauma, however, she cannot quite bring herself to dispatch fantasy altogether. Subtly, she incorporates fantasy unnamed as such by hedging on her definition of reality. She states, "I should like to make a distinction between the two kinds of reality, admitting the existence of a psychic reality, rather than confine the word real to the material plane only." Pages 120 to 121. Whether she acknowledged it or not, with her broader definition, Severn had posited a more complex psychic relationship, albeit undeveloped, between traumatic reality and fantasy. In concluding a brief review of Freud's abandonment of the seduction theory, Severn's 1933a views on trauma mirror Ferenczi's in their attempt to reclaim the primacy of an early external trauma. Experience has convinced me that the patient does not invent, but always tells the truth, even though in a distorted form, and further, that what he tells is mostly of a severe and specific injury, inflicted on him when he was young and helpless. p. 126. Professionally, the book made little impact. It was not reviewed by any psychoanalytic journals and received only marginal interest elsewhere. By May 1935, only 56 copies had been sold in the United States. In the 1930s in London, as a lay analyst, Severn maintained her isolation from the psychoanalytical community even though, in principia, it should have been more open to her than in the United States, where mainstream psychoanalysis was closed to non-medical analysts. She found her own particular niche by returning to her original interest in metaphysics. In November 1933, Severn, 1933b, published a positive article on psychoanalysis titled Psychoanalysis and Spiritual Evolution in the London Forum, formerly the Occult Review. In 1936, she joined the Practical Psychology Club of London and published Don't Be Ashamed of Your Instincts in the Practical Psychology magazine, Severn, 1936. Throughout the 1930s, she continued to travel between the United States and Britain, teaching courses and lecturing to clubs and meetings on such topics as what is a psychic injury and mental catharsis, a means of cure. In late 1939, as World War II loomed, Severn left London for New York, where she lived for the last 20 years of her life. She continued to remain outside psychoanalytic circles. Her lack of academic credentials, her own history of mental instability, and the shadow of controversy over Ferenczi's last work and possibly even her own unvoiced sense of responsibility for his exhaustion and death all contributed to her professional isolation. In the early 1940s, Severn wrote her final book, unpublished, The Anatomy of Love and Sex, a psychological study of love, sex, and marriage, with some counsel to lovers. She continued to practice in New York until her death from leukemia in February 1959, at the age of 79. Severn in the literature. Elizabeth Severn is one of a number of historical patients, mostly women, whose contributions to the development of psychoanalysis have recently been brought to light and reevaluated. Swales, 1986, Kerr, 1988, Shamdasani, 1990, Ellenberger, 1991. Until now, Severn has been a mysterious figure in the psychoanalytic literature. The few, often veiled, references to her have frequently conveyed suspicion, even hostility. For example, in 1957, American analyst Clara Thompson, who was in Budapest until Ferenczi's death, wrote to Eric from 13. In February 1933, Ferenczi had the courage to dismiss a patient who had bullied him for years, Elizabeth Severn. She is one of the most destructive people I know, and there is no doubt Ferenczi was afraid of her. See Thompson T. from November 5, 1957, from Archives, Tübingen, 14. There is reason to believe that, as a fellow pupil and patient, Thompson may have been jealous of Severn's closeness to Ferenczi. Ferenczi, 1932, Shapiro, this volume, which could account for her attack on Severn some 25 years later. That same year, in his Freud biography, Ernest Jones, 1957, observed, "My old friend Ferenczi believed he was being successfully psychoanalyzed by messages transmitted telepathically across the Atlantic from an ex-patient of his, a woman Freud called Ferenczi's evil genius P. for 07.15. Although he does not name her in his book, The Basic Fault, Michael Ballant, 1968, characterizes Ferenczi's intense work with a female patient identified here as Elizabeth Severn as a grand experiment, p. 112. In 1968, as Ferenczi's executor, Ballant had in his possession the then unpublished diary, and Freud, Ferenczi letters, containing the details of Severn's and Ferenczi's work together, including their unknown and unprecedented mutual analysis. He wrote, "It was an experiment on a really grand scale, perhaps the first of its kind in analytic history. The patient got as much time from Ferenczi as she asked for p. 112. Of Ferenczi and others, including himself, Ballant comments, some types of analyst cannot resist this kind of temptation, especially if it emanates from a worthwhile patient." Italics added, 16. Ballant concludes of Ferenczi's grandest experiment, the patient, a talented but profoundly disturbed woman, improved considerably but could not be considered as cured, pages 112 to 113. Geoffrey Masson was the first person to bring Elizabeth Severn out of the shadows. In his 1984 indictment of Freud and psychoanalysis, he names Severn and highlights her major role in Ferenczi's developing ideas, page 161, his return to the trauma theory. Masson argues that it was Ferenczi's self-disclosures and mutual analysis that may have enabled his patients to begin talking about the real traumas of their childhood, p. 161. It appears possible that Mrs. Severn was the first person to spark Ferenczi's interest in real traumas, page 163. Masson adds that she may have helped Ferenczi face the full reality of these traumas, p. 164, 17. Masson, 1988, also draws heavily on excerpts from Ferenczi's diary that mention Severn. He uses her code, name RN, to marshal evidence for his case against psychotherapy. References to Severn also appear in Sabourin, 1985, Haenel, 1988, 1989, and Showolf, 1990. The most extensive treatment of Elizabeth Severn to date is by psychoanalyst Martin Stanton, 1991. Stanton examines aspects of Severn's case and her critical relationship with Ferenczi and mentions her prominently in his chronology of Ferenczi's life. He correctly credits her part in Ferenczi's emphasis on trauma and his development of the relaxation principle. It was a mutual influence, rather than a one-way process from Ferenczi to Severn, p. 162. Furthermore, referring to her 1913 psychotherapy, its doctrine and practice, he suggests that Severn certainly had intimations of active therapy long before she encountered Ferenczi, p. 162. Stanton acknowledges that Severn helped Ferenczi gain insights into countertransference. New York analyst Benjamin Wallstan, 1989-1990, takes the implications of Severn's role in countertransference even further. He believes that when Severn, in her attempt to overcome her analytical impasse, confronted Ferenczi and subsequently demanded that she be able to analyze him, she forced him to recognize the clinical importance of countertransference. Wallstan, 1990, writes, in Ferenczi's case of RN, the therapeutic study of the psychoanalyst's countertransference as a functional correlate of the patient's resistance was first carried out in vivo, p. 568. Wallstan, 1989. Argues that Elizabeth Severn's case has an important place in psychoanalytic history. The case of R.N. is, in my view, a landmark case, a major turning point in the evolution of psychoanalytic therapy. It takes its place alongside those two other well-known failed cases in the history of psychoanalysis, Brewer's case of Anna O. and Freud's case of Dora. All three therapies, though in some critical respects failures, are landmarks for the statement of central concepts of contemporary psychoanalytic therapy. In the case of Anna O., the theory of the hypnoid state; in the case of Dora, transference; and in the case of R.N., countertransference, p. 676. Conclusion. The relationship between Elizabeth Severn and Sandor Ferenczi was a complex and problematic one. Severn's desperate attempt to piece together a cohesive identity from a self shattered by her seemingly horrendous childhood experiences induced Ferenczi to risk radical technical experiments with her and with himself that uncovered unique clinical material probably unavailable to classical analytical technique of the time. The resulting insights were the prime source for Ferenczi's 1933 early understanding of the dynamics of sexual trauma, initial shock, denial, by adults, identification with the aggressor, fragmentation, amnesia, and body memory, which have only in recent years been recognized by the profession. In addition, through Ferenczi's diary, Elizabeth Severn's case continues to offer significant insights into current theoretical and clinical issues in sexual abuse regression, dissociation, and multiple personality, for example, as well as the recovery of early trauma. Through all his cases, but particularly through his treatment of Severn, Ferenczi gained new technical perspectives, many of which are currently the subject of lively debate within psychoanalysis. Ferenczi stressed reliving, not just remembering, the early trauma within the analytical relationship. As a result, he raised the critical importance of this relationship and its potential to promote therapeutic change. Ferenczi addressed the significance of the analyst's personality in treatment. As well, he highlighted the idea that patient resistance and analytical impasses could be a function of countertransference. He anticipated the current study of the role of analyst subjectivity and the benefits and risks in countertransference interpretations and disclosures. At the Wiesbaden Congress in 1932, Ferenczi presented his revolutionary paper, Confusion of Tongues Between Adults and the Child, 1933, containing many ideas from his groundbreaking work with Severn. He charged psychoanalysis with overemphasizing fantasy, affirmed that sexual trauma as the pathogenic factor cannot be valued highly enough, page 161, and called for reforms in psychoanalytic therapy. The paper was dismissed. 9 months later, Ferenczi was dead. Since he left no method and no school, much of his radical last work was left suspended for over 50 years, only recently coming to light with the publication of his clinical diary. The diary also reveals Elizabeth Severn's importance and provides the opportunity to assess more properly her influential role in the development of Ferenczi's last ideas. How are we to view Elizabeth Severn today? As Ferenczi himself remarked, she was a dangerous patient, a potentially destructive person whose insatiable psychological demands undoubtedly consumed him. In retrospect, Ferenczi's degree of receptivity to her unstable psychological state was probably clinically unwise, even naive. It clearly disturbed his mental and emotional balance and no doubt contributed to his final exhaustion. Paradoxically, Elizabeth Severn was also a strong, intuitive, and therapeutically experienced patient, Ferenczi's colleague and teacher, and the catalyst for a number of his revolutionary insights and innovations. Ironically, Freud's assessment of her was probably correct. She was Ferenczi's evil genius. 60 years ago, the work of these two pioneers was branded as heretical, the product of a paranoid, even psychotic analyst and a wicked and deranged American woman. Yet today it reflects much that is central to the domain of psychoanalytic practice. Furthermore, one of the basic premises of their work together is supported by the mounting evidence of widespread child sexual abuse. The tragic experiences of a little girl named Leota Brown in the Midwest United States over a century ago have had far-reaching implications for psychoanalysis. Elizabeth Severn, as RN, may well be one of the most important patients in the history of psychoanalysis. Although not the first sexually abused patient to be analyzed, she was, for her time, the most extensively treated one. Her desperate search to heal her fragmented mental state sustained by her belief in metaphysics and by her own indomitable will took her halfway around the world to the one psychoanalyst who possessed the necessary skill and patience to help her. Sandor Ferenczi opened himself to Elizabeth Severn's terrorism of suffering. Ferenczi, 1932, page 211, understood it and ultimately saved her life. M. Severn, Personal Communication, May 12, 1986. The analytic relationship between Sandor Ferenczi and Elizabeth Severn is history. Through it, Ferenczi was led to question the foundations of psychoanalysis and to challenge his longtime mentor, Sigmund Freud. In so doing, he expanded the frontiers of psychoanalytic theory and technique. Through the relationship, Elizabeth Severn, in her dual role as both patient and analytical partner, was able to transform a psychological life of suffering and pain into a body of clinical and theoretical material that can now be recognized as an enduring contribution to psychoanalysis.